First, these seams between blocks can be filled in so water won't be able to sit in them. And second, these block faces could be covered up to provide just a tiny bit more coverage for the rebar, at least theoretically. And finally, I'll mix up something to deal with this transition against the base, and deal with this honeycombing while I'm at it. Step number 1 in finishing is all about dealing with rain. Rainfall will make water run down the face of the wall, and that'll end up here, where it meets the base. So what I'll do first is I'll make a bevel to force rainfall to run off the base instead of pooling on top of it. And to do so, I'm using the rest of that repair mortar I got. Now I want to force that repair mortar into any uneven bits of the surface here, including honeycombs, but I won't try to get it to stick to the wall. We'll get back to that part soon enough. I've now gotten a good start to my bevel. It's not pretty, but functional. And I've also made sure to use the repair mortar to fill in any larger voids or joints. With that taken care of, I can move on to building the bevel with my regular concrete mix once the costly repair stuff runs out. But I want to make sure I have this in place around the entire wall, front and back, as part of my overall water management. Only when that's done, I can move on to cladding the walls. That cladding is called a Parge coat, and for that what we want is this stuff, tailored to your environment. Now, with bags of this, I can mix parging mortar, which doesn't turn into quite concrete and which definitely isn't structural, but it will stick to the walls and ensure you get a smooth surface. Before actually putting Parge on the wall, there's two things you need to do. First, this needs to be moist. Now you don't want it shiny or dripping wet, but saturated with water so that the block faces won't suck moisture out of your Parge layer. Second, these joints between blocks need to be cleared of debris and any concrete jutting out further than the block faces themselves. That way you get a nice even surface to work with. As for mixing the Parge, if you're doing it by the bucket like me, I found a good trick is to first measure up your water, then add about half a bag before you start running the drill. Then, when you have a nice even slurry, you add the rest of the bag and mix that in. Actually, applying the Parge can be really tricky, and if you try to just stick it on the wall, chances are it'll fall right off. But I found that starting at the bottom and then pressing it onto the wall, and then gradually pressing it upwards, works fairly well. The exception is these joints. You'll want to squeeze the Parge tightly into these really hard before you try making a full smooth layer. As for curing, the Parge does not need the same water treatment that structural concrete does. If I had a way to make plastic stick, I'd just cover this up, but instead I'll just mist it lightly for a couple of days and then leave it to dry. And with the sides all done, it's time for the cherry on top, so to speak. To make sure no moisture is allowed to pool on top of and then seep into the wall proper, I'm finishing off the Parge job with a thin layer up here, slanted slightly towards the back of the wall so water will run off that way. Now, you might be wondering, wouldn't it have been easier to just fix this up when I poured the top courses with the crown? Put the outside boards a little higher up so that the top sloped back and then finish this all off smoothly? And to that I say, yes, it would have. But I got it into my head that I wanted a Parge layer totally covering the whole structure, sides and top and all, so there we are. And after a whole lot of frustrating hours, I'm left with a complete layer of Parge covering the entirety of my wall. But we're not done yet, because not only does this look prettier, It also means that there are now 0 nooks and crannies where this thing cannot reach. But before any brushwork, I'll break out my trowel one last time to work along the length of the wall, knocking off any podge droppings from the bevel here or any outcroppings on the wall. All done, and I've also cleaned up the ground where base meets bedrock, because now it's time for the final touch to seal this wall up. This stuff, which gives me a breathable, water-resistant slurry coat. Now, a coat of vapor-tight sealant might seem smarter, but I want my wall to be able to breathe since I'm in a freeze-thaw environment. I just need some slight prep work before I start mixing, starting with the sprayer to ensure my now completely dried Parge layer gets nice and moist. See, the fresh Parge needed to be kept misted for a couple of days, but I then let it dry out for almost a week after curing. That's because I really don't want a lot of moisture trapped inside the slurry coat. So what I'm doing now is making sure that coat gets a good bond, same as with the formwork blocks before concrete and also Parge. And I'm also wetting the base because the slurry coat will cover everything. And you also want to make sure you're working within the right temperature range for that slurry, both in the air and on the surface you're applying it to, as per the manufacturer's instructions. Finally, I wanted to show you that even though it might look that way when mixed, since it'll turn entirely white, I'm not using any latex admixture in the water for this slurry coat. And now the slurry is all mixed up and ready to go on the wall. Now, when applying this, you want to push it hard onto the wall in not too thick layers. This is to ensure all the little pores in the Parge, of which there's a lot, get filled. And this is a pretty okay thickness for the first coat. So I'll now start at the bottom, making sure not to dirty the brush, and then work my way all the way over and around to the other side, brushing in a crosshatch pattern to ensure total coverage for the first coat. Now the first coat is applied and dried, making this wall a good deal more durable for it. But I'll still want to put on a second coat, not just to stop the material below from shining through, but also to make sure I don't leave any pinholes or skips in this water-resisting layer. Boom! Second coat in place. And with a couple of coats of slurry applied, and then just left to dry, this wall is solidly in surely it's done now, right territory. I wish. No, but really it could be. This would hold up great. But I can still add a lot more years of service life to this thing, and the really hard work is now behind us. Full disclosure, the actual reasoning in building this wall is that I thought it would look nice next to this footpath I had planned. So now that most of the wall is in place, I'll just clean up here and finish up that road work real quick. Boom, again. One footpath down. Back to the wall, you can see it's getting stained by splash and organic matter decomposing, and I don't like it getting all moist. So I'll hop in the back of this thing and start fixing that. But before fixing anything, there's been a lot of leaves and dirt accumulating against the back of the wall since I got it in place. And that's relevant to how I'll prevent my drain pipes from clogging, like I promised that I'd show you. So now I'll just clean up along the whole back of the wall and show you. And with my drain inlets clear and the bedrock free of debris along the whole wall, especially around the inlets, it's time for me to lay down my geotextile. And this is a non-woven synthetic cloth which will act as a filter, keeping any gunk away from my drain pipes. When putting down your geotex, you optimally want it in a continuous full-length sheet, so that fines can't infiltrate along the bottom. And that's why I've dressed my wall up like this, because next I can pull the continuous sheet down into the ditch behind the wall, holding on to the sides and just walking and stepping in the middle of this thing. This lets me center the fabric against the foot of the base all along its length. With the filter tucked into place, there's just one more thing I want to do back here before filling it. To make sure the back of the wall stays dry, I'll be using scissors, a flexible waterproof sealant, a hammer and these nails to get a plastic dimple sheet in place. These nails are made especially for that purpose and come with a pad which helps keep things in place. I also chose the shortest length I could of nail since I don't want these biting deep into my wall. And this is of course the dimple sheet. Now I'll only be using a few fasteners along a single line near-ish to the top, since it'll mainly be up to the backfill to keep the sheet in place. When mounting sheets like this, you should have the dimples pointing inwards so that air can circulate behind it and let the wall breathe. Now, you don't have to do this, and I'll be using a trick making it even less important for me in just a minute, but anything that gets buried is going to remain, if not wet, then at least moist, basically forever. Putting in a sheet of plastic like this is then an ultra cheap extra layer of protection, adding even more years to the project. And as always, putting this in as a continuous sheet would have been best, but it's a real hassle to work with this stuff, so I'll be cutting lengths off down to where the bevel on my base slopes out, so that water coming down the wall will run off of that. And I'll also ensure my sheets have at least half a meter or so of overlap when I nail them to the wall. I've now started getting a few nails in, but when I started out, I did not consider what happens when you start hammering nails against a thin layer of Parge. And the answer is, it cracks like an egg. So pilot holes are definitely your friend, and if you decide to drill those using your rotary hammer, make sure it's set to drilling only and not to hammering. But a regular drill with a mercenary bit the size of your nails is a lot easier. But even with pilot holes, I ended up having to graduate to a heavier hammer than the first one I showed, just to be able to get these things seated properly. And as the last step, even if this is sort of just to help me sleep at night, I'm sealing off the nails and the holes they made in the sheet with my sealant. Just in case it can help a little bit in keeping the sheet from tearing and keeping water from getting in. With my dimple sheet now in place and solid overlaps on all seams, I'm pretty much ready to start work on the actual backfill. But a note on these gaps up top, they do look a bit dramatic, but the main point of this plastic is not to keep any and all water off the wall. It's to keep the moisture in the backfill from pressing against it. And speaking of, it's time to get some stuff into this geotextile. And this is that stuff. These are bags of foam glass, which is a super lightweight material since 80% of it by volume is just air. And I will be putting this in along my wall in a 50 to 100 centimeter wide band, almost all the way to the top. And this stuff is just really cool because not only does it weigh next to nothing, it's also very free draining, so it won't hold a ton of water. And it's got a high friction angle, it's rough stuff, so it doesn't really want to go anywhere. And for me, it helps that it's easy to carry. My U-shaped sheet of geotex isn't going to reach all the way to the top. So I'm going to have to cut some sheets to overlap on the sides, so I can get this wrapped all around over the top, getting a continuous layer of filtering textile around the entire foam glass filling. And I'll take care that I tuck my dimple sheet neatly against the wall as I'm doing this. But when this wrapped part is done, even if it's just a short distance out from the back of the wall, I'll have gotten a great drainage layer behind the wall. and a weight reduction of about a good-sized car for every cubic meter of foam glass I put in instead of regular soil, reducing the forces acting on that wall. As I've been building my band of foam glass here, I've also had to grow the height of the rest of the backfill at the same rate. Now, I've been using crushed concrete roofing tiles, which I had a few tons of laying around, but any coarse aggregate will do. But finishing this part is something which can wait until the ground thaws, so I'll instead turn to how I can improve the front of my wall. And the answer to that is planks. My Parge and slurry is nice, but mounting a layer of wood cladding on top of it will let me create a whole dry little microclimate across the whole front of this wall. And if that's kept just a few centimeters away from the actual front, not only will air be able to circulate behind it, but any rain and UV radiation beating down from above will no longer wear on the wall itself. But since bolting the planks straight on is a terrible proposition, I need a few more things first. First, obviously, the boards which will constitute the cladding. Next, the battens or furrings, which those boards will be nailed onto, for which I'm going with 36 by 48mm. And in addition to pre-painting my boards, I've also pre-treated them and the cut ends of this wood with a really nasty biocidal primer. Next, finding the best way to stick the battens to the masonry was trickier than I'd expected, but I will be going with these. These are grade A4 stainless steel panhead concrete screws. They're kinda pricey, but these things need to be pretty thick and they will be sitting a meaningful distance into the sides of my wall. Taken together, that means that if they ever start rusting for any reason, they're going to expand by a lot and cause some pretty severe damage. But this grade of steel, embedded in concrete and sitting in a dry ventilated cave out of contact with less noble metals, rust should basically never have a chance to get started. For mounting the boards, I'm not as terrified of rust jacking, so I'll not be using quite as Gucci fasteners. Still, these nails are rated corrosion class C4, which is fairly hostile environment, and that should be more than sufficient. Now, I'm going to use my rotary hammer to drill holes in the wall in accordance with the specifications for my screws. And reading these is super important. Mine want an 8mm hole in the mounting hardware they're going to clamp on, meaning the battens. But I'll also need a 6mm wood bit, same diameter as the masonry bit on my rotary as specified, and I'll show you why when I get to drilling. Using the rotary on concrete, compressed air is going to be important as well, because unlike smooth granite, concrete drilling gets super dusty, which would mess things up for my screws. So safety glasses on, I'll blow those holes clean. And again, read the screw specs. If you're American, I also understand you guys measure screws weirdly, so make sure you know what diameter holes you actually need to drill. But first, I'm going to draw some lines on my wall. Though, maybe on a day it's not 16 degrees below. Spring is here, and it's time to get to marking up my wall. Soon I'll be drilling holes in the face here, and I do not want to risk hitting any steel. The horizontal bars don't worry me, but the verticals have a lot less cover out this way. Maybe just a couple of centimeters if I was sloppy anywhere. So before I run my drill bit in through the face, I want to have marked up where all my rebar lives, so I can make sure I miss it. Using my trusty levels and measuring tape, I should be able to mark out every single bar and then get the cladding in place. And I was going to show in detail how I found the position of each bar using only those tools, but after marking up everything and recording that, I realized that only gave me 22 bars in this section, where I know there are 23. As it turns out, that little trick I did with pre-slicing the blocks and laying them end to end, it was the most precise way to position the rebar, but it also means I cannot easily and confidently calculate where they are now. So I went out and got one of these instead. It's a stud finder that should be able to reach about 12 centimeters into the concrete for steel, which happens to be roughly where they ought to be if I wasn't sloppy. A smarter man might have bought an actual rebar locator with deeper range, but this should help me steer clear of any obvious dangers at least. With the actual danger zones now drawn up, I can get to fastening my battens. So, holding this against the wall, I've made some corresponding marks on the wall and wood to indicate where I want holes. And I'm starting at one end of the long face using pre-cut battens, which should follow the curve nicely later on. Next, I'm getting my wood bit out, using the same diameter as the masonry bit I'll later stick in the wall. And I'll start by drilling pilot holes directly through these battens, one for each of the marks I made. I then get my rotary hammer and check that it's preset to drill mode only, since I don't want to smash the Parge apart. And it then slips straight through the pilot hole with no problem. And I'm also making sure it gets a hard stop at just the right depth. So using this rod here, not just measuring it by eye, but checking how much bit sticks out behind a batten, I can make sure I get to exactly where I want to be inside the wall for my particular screws. First hole drilled, time to get it clean. Oops. I'll also occasionally verify using this little tube that my hole depth remains correct as I move up the wall. And this first one is at least looking pretty okay. It's not very precise, but it's good to just make sure nothing is slipping or getting out of alignment. Then it's time for the bigger wood bit, because when I mount the battens with my concrete screws, I don't want them to bite into the wood, I want them to clamp it. So I want a hole through the wood that provides a snug fit, but not so snug that I get a lot of thread engagement. So using the bigger bit, it is the bigger bit, yep, I'll just expand the hole we already got. There we go. Nice and snug. Time to get this on the wall. Here we are, first screw is going in, and I'm driving these in by hand. I absolutely do not want to strip the holes, and I'm also careful not to over tighten, since I'll need the battens to be able to move, at least with the first screw in, so you'll see in a second. And with the first screw almost fully in, the batten is still free to slide up and down. That lets me get the next pilot hole in it into the right height where the masonry bit can do its job, and the next one. And when all the holes are done, I can drive screws into the whole batten before starting on the next, working my way up the whole wall. And if you want something inside your cavity, like these conduits I'll be running behind my paneling, this is the time to mount it. So right here I've put in these tiny nylon plugs, which will expand thanks to these stainless screws, which will carry these stainless clips, which will easily hold the conduits firmly in place. When it's time to nail the boards to the buttons, I think it can save some time to preset the nails into the boards. That way, I don't need to waste any time finicky measuring when I'm holding the boards up to drive the nails home. This is starting to really come together now, but I've run into a tiny snag. The spacing of these rear boards are governed by the position of the screw heads for the buttons, as well as the gaps between the buttons themselves. Let's see if I can... maybe it's easier down here. You can just see this board is straddling one such gap. And all that means is that the spacing between the boards is not really as uniform as I'd planned for and as I would have liked, but that's a problem for when I put up the next layer. And this single horizontal board is just there to carry an LED strip which will light up the footpath below, but for now it's time to focus on finishing the first layer of cladding. And with all that done, I'm just dabbing a spot of paint on any nail penetration, scuffs or bruises on my board's paint. Now, pre-treating whole boards is a bit of a chore, so the boards for the front layer I've only primed and painted the end grains of, plus a little bit of wraparound. Since these won't disappear behind anything, I'll just nail them up on top of the backboards and then finish treating them in place. And with that, the cladding is done. I've not been able to fully fix the spacing between boards, but I'll just consider that rustic charm and call it done. As for the backfill, I've been hauling buckets of aggregate back here while waiting for paint to dry, and for my purposes, this is deep enough. I've also shaped it to slope slightly back, so when my topsoil is in place, some water can run out and around here, instead of soaking into the ground and then depending on my drain pipes to get it out. Then, looking at the top of my wall here, I think I want that to stand a little bit proud. So after putting down some separating geotextiles so the topsoil doesn't just disappear, I'm going to pour on topsoil up to around this level. Boom! Backfill done! Now I can just get some seeds and plants in here and I'll have a whole extra bit of garden to frolic in. But this means the video is basically done too. Literally the only things remaining are to get some kind of termination in place to hold the dimple sheet tops tight against the wall, and then to get a similar solution in place over the top of my cladding. Now this temporary roof can stay for a little while though, because I'm thinking I'll get a sheet metal roof in place eventually, which can clamp the dimple sheet while also letting water drip down in front of the wooden boards. But that's not super urgent and I'm just not fully decided on style for that yet. So that's one way to build a retaining wall on bedrock. Did I overdo some things? Yes. I probably could have gotten away with a lot less rebar, but living by the better safe than having the wall collapse on you rule, I went a bit conservative and rounded up on the rebar table. I probably could also have used less super strong concrete, but I'm happy I used the latex I did, even if a super plasticizer might have been the same effect practically for less money. Where I did not go overboard was on the drainage, the wet curing, and the rebar cover. All of those were minimums I'd happily do again. I think the detailing is probably where I went the most overboard. I could have done more as well. I could have gone with stainless rebar. I could have gone with even more foam glass. I could have gone with fiber reinforced concrete, but I didn't, so there's that. But if this helped you and if you learned anything, leaving a thumbs up would make me feel good. And if I did something terribly wrong, share your wisdom in the comments below. Someone watching this 10 years from now might learn from you. And if you decide to set out on a project like this yourself, good luck! Bring friends.